So for tonight, we'll start off in 1 Corinthians 13. Yeah. But we'll be in, we'll start at verse 8. Love never fails, but where there are prophecies, they will cease. Where there are tongues, they will be stilled. Where there is knowledge, it will pass away. For we know in part, and we prophesy in part. But when perfection comes, the imperfect disappears. When I was like a child, I talked like a child, I thought like a child, I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I put childish ways behind me. Now we see but a poor reflection as in a mirror. Then we shall see face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I am known fully. And now these three remain: faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of these is love. So, given this message and the reason why we go to this particular chunk, because the message is not about love, it's about hope. And kind of the reality of it. And the reason why we go over this part is because it's when Paul starts talking about the kind of paradigm shift that happens when we find ourselves in states of perfection versus imperfection. See, we all understand that right now, in contrast to when we stand before God, we sit in a place of imperfection. We're limited by our own understanding. That's essentially what Paul's saying here. He talks about how when I was a child, I thought like a child. We're all children right now. The Bible doesn't often call people men of God, but it does refer to us as children a lot. Jesus refers to us as children. God refers to Israel as his children. He refers to us as his children. And there's a lot more reason behind that than just the simple, he's our father, we're his children. But it is a statement about kind of the reality of where we sit. See, when you're reborn, you find yourself being brought into a new place as a new person. Emotionally, spiritually, it's like you've been renewed in a way. But the thing that happens with this is that, there's still a lot of the world around us. And as a result of that, even if you're reborn, you can still grow up stunted. And this happens all the time. Like there are so many people who we see in the church, and even some of us, like I've been this person so many times, where there are aspects of who I am that stop me from really delving into the deeper parts of who God is. And ironically, hope is one of those things. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment, but it's just this reality when Paul's talking about this. Now we see but a poor reflection is in a mirror. You know that mirrors actually do not provide you with the clearest picture of your face, right? So it was actually Jeremy who sent me a video where there was a woman doing a TED Talk. She was an identity counselor or something like that. Anyway, but she talked about the nature of mirrors and the way that most mirrors, when you buy them, they actually only project so much of your face, your person, your appearance. They make you look more attractive, or they adjust certain things. It's very rare that you actually get to see the clearest picture of who you are. And the truth of the matter is that when we talk about us as people, we also only see so much of a picture of life and circumstance. It's why Paul talks about this mirror thing. And this was especially true at their point in time. They used to have, their mirrors were usually made of bronze at this point. If you've ever seen a bronze mirror, and tried to look at yourself in that, it's bad. Like, it's just so, you compare it to like a modern mirror as opposed to one at this point in time, and it's just kind of like, it's warped and dull. So the thing of it is it's just kind of to establish this reality of like, we don't understand everything right now. We don't see everything right now. Whether we're talking about love, faith, hope, any of those aspects here, it's not always easy to see the reality. Not through our own purview, not through our own perspective. Now, the thing about it is, as far as talking about hope is concerned, he talks about it at the end here because it's one of these three remaining virtues that are so incredibly important. And it's not even that they're important right now. They are. But they're important going forward. See, in the context of this, when he talks about it, he's talking about when perfection has come. When you're already there with God, when you're in the most ideal state. Faith, love, and hope are still three extremely important things. Which might seem kind of funny when you think about it, because most of us think, well, when you're in heaven, why would you have to hope for anything? I mean, God's right there. What's there to hope for? And I know I've talked about this before in older messages, but in particular, this point is that part of the reason why hope is important, even once we're past the point of being here, is that free will doesn't go away. See, oftentimes I think we forget, because we kind of idealize heaven in a lot of ways. We've created an interpretation of what heaven is like, as opposed to what it actually is. And we like that idealized version because it removes any and all fear. We don't have to worry anymore. We don't have to think anymore. We don't have to care anymore. We're just going to go up there to this paradise where, we're going to be taken care of and everything's going to be peaceful. It's going to be really great. And even though there are some truths to that, there's also this aspect to it that our will not be removed. It's part of like why hell is a thing. At the end of the day, your will as a person, your free will still be there. And if your free will still has you in a place where you might have done all the things and said all the right prayers and so on, but your will is still completely against God, you'll still find yourself in the opposite end of things. Because at the end of the day, we forget that the beginning of this story, the fall of man, came as a result of a place of perfection being defiled by the choices that we're allowed to make. By a spirit, by Satan himself coming and despoiling it by bringing that sin in. See, Satan had free will and he chose to oppose God. He was in heaven. Like, he was in that place of idealized perfection that we always look to. So the reality is that when Paul here talks about the importance of hope and faith, those things are still just as important in heaven, because there's still the hope that we're not going to have to repeat this kind of thing again. That we're not going to have another spiritual war happening. That's why this is important. That's why why the need for hope extends beyond right now and into eternity. But see, the issue that we run into is that hope As a result, hope is one of the most constantly attacked things in our lives. Paul says these three things are so incredibly important: faith, hope, and love. What are the three most constantly attacked things in our lives? Those specific things. You know, when we talk about like spiritual warfare, when we talk about demons and, you know, false gods and different things like that, what do they so often go after? They try to diminish our faith, they try to make us give up hope, and they try to make us give up on love. Whether that's giving up our faith entirely or weakening it so it makes it very difficult. It's why we have so many messages about doubt. It's why we have to sit around and work through doubts and kind of try to see through those in order to walk forward following God. It's why love is such a difficult thing. It's why so many relationships are being broken over and over and over again. It's why so many of us believe that we're unworthy of love, or why we believe we're worthy of too much love, as that can be just as bad of a thing. If we believe that we deserve to be worshipped on some level, that's just as bad as, or just as destructive, I'll put it that way, as believing that we're never fit to be loved by anybody. Because in both situations, it puts us in places that set us apart, not only from God, but from society around us. What's more is if you're in a relationship with somebody, a loving, like romantic relationship, and you want them to worship you, it doesn't go well. You'll find yourself very alone many times over. You might be able to find new people all the time because a lot of people are attracted to confidence, men and women both, like it doesn't really matter. But you won't be able to keep them for long because they'll just get tired of you. They'll get tired of your crap. They'll challenge you, they'll fight with you, and you'll get tired of the fighting. And it just becomes this constant cycle of having to find somebody new because you want love, but you can't actually like even sit with it for very long. On the other hand, if you don't believe you deserve love and you're in that romantic relationship, that can be just as much of a trial, because you're going to find yourself dealing with the fact that, you know, this person's pouring themselves out for you and you can't accept it. You think that they're joking with you, they're screwing with you, they're just waiting for that chance to tell you, oh, what a fool you are, you believed for a minute. Now I unfold my elaborate master plan that I've spent 10 years preparing with all of that effort and time and care. Both of these, there are so many things where love becomes something that gets so attacked over and over and over again. And it's a thing. Even just the very concept of it, what it means to love or be loved, what it means to be faithful or have faith. But to be specific, we're looking at hope. And hope is one of those things, it's interesting too, because all three of these things can be used to affect each other just as much. Can an attack on love be used to also attack hope? Yes, of course. And faith? Yes, of course. Can an attack on hope be used to affect those? Of course. Because they're very much so linked. And see, the thing about hope is that it's imperative to our existence. See, things like depression come in when we find ourselves not having hope anymore. And I understand that there are times when we have imbalances of brain chemicals and things like that, but I also understand that there are a lot of psychological issues that develop over time as people are forced into situations that create an environment for their body to give up producing those chemicals, or for them to accept a certain perspective or viewpoint that holds them down. And I say that because, like I said, hope has actually always been a really hard thing for me. To be specific, I'll never forget being nicknamed the Prophet of Gloom by an old friend of mine. Like, she said this, and it sucked because it was very accurate. If there's one thing that I've always been great for, that God's been able to trust me with, it's delivering bad news. Often, like in my early years of working in the church, I felt more often like a grim reaper than anything in the Bible. So I would show up and I'd have, things that legitimately were from God, and they were words of either rebuke or correction or, warning. That was a big one. I think more than anything, I got words of warning, and he talked to me about the importance of giving those warnings. Until I finally asked him to, give me encouraging words once in a while, because it was just kind of soul crushing in a way. I mean, at least he could trust me to do the thing. I've worked with a ton of prophets and things like that where they can't do it. God gives them a corrective word for somebody, and they're just like, oh, that can't be from God. There's no way. Or they know it's from God, and they're just like, no. I don't want that confrontation on my shoulders. The truth of the matter is that it's important for us to be able to be open for whatever God has for us. The trouble with this is that this came out of a place of me not really having a lot of hope. And that had kind of shaded my general overview of life And that had been there since I was a little kid. And it's always interesting when I go and look back on it. I remember a friend of mine, an old friend of mine, a former friend of mine, getting after me. He was so frustrated. He was a pastor of a church, and I frustrated him to no end because we would talk about, my past, and I'd tell him, I just did things because God told me to. I didn't actually have any hope in that. Well, you totally had hope. You wouldn't have done it if you didn't have hope. No, you don't understand. I felt nothing. No, you had to feel something. You wouldn't have done it if you didn't feel something. Yeah, I felt an obligation to do what God wanted me to do because I cared about God and what he wanted, not about what was going to happen. I didn't care what happened. I went up, I gave the word, and then left it where it was. And sometimes they were really great things, and people were just blown away, and their lives were changed. And I felt nothing. I just watched and saw them be blown away and stuff. I'm like, okay, I'm gonna go on to the next. And the thing of it was that hope's always been a funny thing because oftentimes I've made the mistake of believing that it's a feeling. And the thing about hope, like love and faith, is that they don't actually correlate to your feelings so much as they correlate to realities. See, feelings are really fickle. I have probably felt hopeful a number of times in life that is probably astonishingly low compared to what others may have gone through. I look at some of my friends and their charmed existences and think to myself, man, I wish I would have had that childhood. Or man, I wish I had that perspective. Or man, I wish I could be that optimistic. Or man, I changed my mind actually because they totally just got themselves into a lot of trouble, and if they would have been slightly more realistic, they would have not suffered that indignance. The point is that in all of this, I had a limited purview of what it meant to have hope. And the thing about it is that the funny thing is, looking at all those friends after years of ministering to people, it's been almost 10 years now that I've been working in ministry. And the interesting thing about time is that you watch those people move from one situation to the next, and have different things arrive and test their faith, test their hope, test their belief, test their feelings more than anything else. And you know what's funny about people who felt hopeful is that when things actually got to the point where they couldn't feel it anymore, they lost their hope. And that's kind of a thing. You know, God will protect you and defend you and fight for you, and he'll never leave you as long as you don't tell him to leave you. But the thing of it is that doesn't mean that these things are not going to be attacked. You know, we talk about, whenever I say attack, a lot of people presume that I mean like demonically. I mean, sure, like they'll do it. We've spent like 2 months talking about spiritual warfare because of the reason that that's an extremely important aspect of being a Christian. Acknowledging that that's a problem that we have to deal with. I mean, how many times did Jesus talk about it explicitly? You read the Old Testament as a whole and count the number of times that they talk about evil spirits, and then you look at the 4 Gospels, and Jesus talks about evil spirits and demons more in the 4 Gospels than the entire Old Testament. He came with a message which was specifically, guys, there's an enemy there. You're not seeing him because you can't see him, but he's real. That's the bad guy. But it's not just that. When I talk about attack, I mean not only spirits, but I mean people, I mean circumstances, I mean ourselves. You know, just a couple weeks ago we talked about that critical spirit that so many of us have, that kind of self-destructive thing that exists in our psyches that's constantly there to just tear us down. And the thing of it is that is just as capable, we, in and of ourselves, are just as capable of being destructive to our ability to hope as anything else. So that's what I mean when I talk about attack. It's not just spirits. People will come at you. People will come at you with their limited perspectives. Sometimes they'll be driven by spirits. Sometimes they'll be driven by their own limited perspective because they grew up in situations or existed in situations of hopelessness. And now they have this jaded perspective. And when they catch you in those moments of feeling weak, that's going to feel so real. And the funny thing about people, it's funny and sad, but people actually learn more often and remember it better when it's a painful memory than when it's a good memory. So I can remember a time when, you know, I had some bad stuff happen. You know, God sent me this woman and told me he wanted me to marry her. And she ultimately decided against it. And like, there were plenty of times when I think about it that, you know, God spoke to me about that whole situation and about how this was protected and how, you know, there were choices involved and all these different things that he did to try to help me see that this wasn't actually within my control. On the other hand, what I remember most easily right off the bat is the time when I was laying in bed and had a demon specifically say to me, you know, how messed up are you that, you know, the God of heaven and earth can't even find someone to love you? That I remember very well. That's kind of the unfortunate aspect of being human and the way that we work mentally. It sucks. And it makes it incredibly easy for us to fall into systems of belief that are ultimately completely destructive. And by that I mean completely hopeless. Because we can start to see the world. You remember the Dark Knight Rises, when Bane sends Batman to the prison that he used to be in. I can't remember what it was called, Hell on Earth or something like that. but it was basically just a hole in the ground. And there was a way up. And, you know, they had a rope that people could be connected to and that whole thing. Not to kind of like delve too much into that particular like moment, but it was the concept behind it, where the real part of the prison was that there was the hope of escape, and they would try and fail over and over and over again, and as a result it created in them a system of belief that was that you can never escape. There's no point. This is where you are now. This is all that you are. You're whoever you are at the bottom of this hole, looking up, always knowing that there's the possibility and knowing that you will never have it. See, we talk about, like, you'll occasionally hear churches talk about, like, a poverty mindset or a poverty spirit. You'll hear them talk about, like, an orphan spirit or an orphan mindset. There are a lot of different things, but what all of them are pointing at is a belief system that has you lacking in ability to see the truth. See, if it's poverty, it's the idea that you believe that you will never have money, you will never be safe, you will never be comfortable, you will never have these things. You will always exist in a state of feeling unsafe, unkept, uncared for, lost, whatever. The same is true with the orphan thing. It's the idea that you will never be loved. You'll never have family, you'll never have people around you who care about you, you'll never have friends, you'll never have any of these things. So we generate these mindsets and we adhere to them because our experiences that we remember tell us that this is reality. And this is all the reality that there is. And that if there was any other reality, you're a fool to believe in it because it's not for you. Other people might have it, but you can't. You specifically can never have this. And it's a lie. Obviously, it's a lie. Logically, that's stupid. That's a stupid thing to believe. See, the funny thing about it is when you look at things logically, honestly, the opportunity for a good thing to happen is just as likely as the opportunity for a bad thing to happen, unless you do something really dumb, like jump off of an 18-foot building onto some rocks. Okay, there's only one thing that's going to happen. You're going to fall and it's going to hurt. That's it. But when we're talking about so much in life, when you walk up and ask a girl out on a date, for example, it's one or the other. You're just as likely to have a no, as you are to have a good, or have a yes. The thing of it is that, like, those things are not set in stone. Unless you stack the deck against yourself, which we do all the time, we do it. Self-destruction, self-sabotage are huge things. We perpetuate our own cycles of hopelessness. It happens all the time. I mean, using that example of like the date thing, going up and asking somebody out, how often do we like freak out about it before we do it? Because what we're thinking about is what we're feeling, and we're feeling doubtful. Because our experiences have us reminding us of all these things that we felt in the past and just how bad it feels instead of what's possible. So because we're not looking at possibility, and in fact we're just looking at what we're feeling at the time, it's actually going to lend itself to us and actually create a circumstance where we're going to sabotage ourselves. Because we're going to cop out at the last minute, or we're going to give up. Or we're going to sit back and say, well, okay, this is silly, I need to not do this. All because we're afraid. All because we don't have hope in that situation. We don't have hope in ourselves. See, we don't see the value in ourselves, the thing that's worth actually going up and giving to somebody else. So because we don't see that, because we only see our past experiences, our doubts, and all these other things, we'll stop ourselves right then and there, and we'll turn around and we'll run. Because it's better to beat ourselves up for being weak than it is for being rejected. And that's a self-fulfilling thing. Like, God didn't look down on you and say, hey, you should have no hope in yourself. Go be miserable. On the contrary, like, we always go back to this discussion about, the way that Jesus died for our sins. But it's specifically this thing. It's the perspective that God had, that we were so valuable that he would give up a part of himself for us. He can't die, but he would if he could. And he'll even present an avatar of himself to do that. That's a lot of value. That's a lot of meaning. When I was in basic training, listening to the drill sergeant specifically talk to us, one of the biggest things that they were on about was, their battle buddies. And I remember the days when, the hardest days for us, because we were dumb and loud, were the days when the anniversaries for the days that they lost their friends. In a couple of those cases, those were friends that died to protect the drill sergeants that we had. So that was pretty meaningful. There's a great deal of significance, and the value of that sacrifice wasn't lost on them, because they didn't grow up in a church with people pitching that at them every 5 minutes to try to justify some statement or another. They had an actual person who was their close and personal friend who fought for them and literally died for them to protect them from death themselves. So that was valuable. And they understood that. So as a result, with that perspective, maybe we can get an idea of what God looks at us and sees. And maybe in that we can actually gain a little bit of hope in ourselves as people, as individuals, for the way we are, to be able to go forward in life and actually exist in a way that isn't constantly beating ourselves up or sabotaging ourselves, isn't constantly looking at the most negative possible perspective as the only possible reality that we can have. See, the funny thing about it is that with that friend of mine I was talking about, who got so frustrated with me, was that the thing about hope that I learned a long time ago and maybe didn't actually put together was that it's not a feeling, it's a fact. See, if we keep looking at hope as just something that we feel at this time or that, we're never going to have it for long, because feelings are fleeting, they're fickle, they change at a moment's notice. You can go from feeling on top of the world one day and then just have one moment, one phone call from somebody that you don't want to hear from. One moment when somebody shows up, one moment when you randomly drop something. And it's just that easy for us to shift from this was the best day of my life to, man, this is a terrible day. That's the downside of emotions. Even though they're very important for us to have, to understand, to feel, they can also be very dangerous in this respect, that they can actually have such a damaging effect on our ability to function. It's why we kind of need to balance it out with emotion and logic. And when we talk about logic, the idea that hope is a fact is the idea that, you don't really know what's going to come tomorrow. You don't really know what's going to happen. Going back to that example of going up and asking that person out for a date, you don't honestly know what's going to happen. You don't know if they're going to say yes or no, because you have no ability to control that person. You have no ability to get inside their head and determine what they're going to do. All that you'd have is what you're doing when you're walking up and asking the question. And yeah, like I said, you can sabotage yourself all the way up to them until you give up. Or you can just go up and let them make the choice and not let your ability, your lack of belief in yourself, your lack of hope in life get in the way. And asking somebody out is just one small example. And there are so very many more in life that we face every day. And it's important for us to recognize that we need to stop seeing hope as what we feel and start seeing it as what it is. You know, a couple weeks ago, we talked about God and, you know, how we have to allow him personage, in the sense that, you know, God has his own character, his own person. Well, hope is part of that. You know, we've heard the verses where it talks about how God is love and how faith is important with God. But there's also this thing about him where it talks about him being faithful, his faithfulness. God will be faithful to you. And the thing that's really hard about that is that we don't always feel that. And because we don't feel that, we stop believing in that. See, it's a funny thing because, like, you know, when you take it down to like a personal level, if Jeremy disappoints me on a personal level, I can lose hope in Jeremy. But does that actually change Jeremy's character? For me, sure. But Jeremy himself remains the person that he is. My feelings, my perspective of him actually has zero effect on his person. And I can run around and tell everybody else, you know, what happened and how I don't have hope in him anymore. But it still doesn't change Jeremy. He still is who he is. And the same ends up being true with God. And the thing of it is that my feelings could change. Jeremy could do something that just like wows me, blows me away, and suddenly I have hope in him all over the place again. It's that fickle side of emotions. But the thing of it is, when we talk about God and his character, we have to understand that our emotional response doesn't actually dictate his character. We're not in control of him. Our perspective does not generate and is not the end-all be-all of reality. It projects our personal perspective of it, our shades of gray, but it doesn't actually have an effect on reality itself. That's why we have to look at some of these things as logical instead of based on feelings. There are a lot of things in life that are bigger than our perspective. Many, many things. And we talk about faith, hope, and love. Those are bigger than our perspective. So at the end of the day, you know, we need to start getting out of our own heads. And I say this as much for myself as anybody else here, because it has been a long, hard year. And December was a long, hard month. Probably worse than any of the past couple years. And the thing of it is that in the course of that, I have had many times where I've had no hope going forward. I've felt completely hopeless. But I've needed to continue on moving and hoping for something to change. And that doesn't stop. And again, you know, there's this mindset that's kind of like saved me a number of times. It's that, you know, no matter how bad things look today, they might be better tomorrow. And if they're not, there's always the next day. Because the truth of the matter is that we live one day at a time, 1 hour at a time, and you would be amazed at how much can change in a day or a week. I remember, like, you know, just regarding the churches that I've worked in, how much happens in the course of a week. I remember taking a vacation and going out to just visit my dad for a month out in Minnesota, and then coming back, and it felt like the entire world over here went through some like seismic paradigm shift, and I'm just like, what happened? It's like somebody dropped a nuclear bomb on everybody, and now everybody's in pieces. It was a month, guys. Like, nobody could hold out for a month. So it just kind of, yeah, right?
I like it.
Yeah.
Pretty good.
But it's just one of those things where, like, you know, we have to stop looking at everything based off of how we feel about it. Feelings are valid. It doesn't make them right. So.
That's very interesting you say that.
So, it ends up being
Thank
one of
you.
these things, for sure.
That's emotions pretty much power people,
Mm-hmm.
you know?
Yeah.
But it's not the best.
Yeah.
So, how do we understand our emotions and, you know, not disconnect from them,
Yeah.
right? But like still have them
Yeah.
and understand them.
Yeah.
That's, I think, the challenge.
That is always the challenge.
Okay.
Like, the truth of the matter is that when we talk about, you know, emotion and logic, like I said, there needs to be a balance between the two, because
Yeah.
neither one is more important than the other. Your
They're
feeling
together.
Exactly. So your feelings about something, they matter significantly.
Okay.
But
Ask her,
hmm?
the female person.
Ask her what?
Ask her anything.
I am
No, I mean,
totally
just saying,
mad.
like, females have more intuitive feelings.
Mhm.
Well, they do.
Well, it's
They
only
do.
because she doesn't.
Maybe not you.
I block them off, just like
Is that-
all
that
the
was-
dudes.
Yeah, just not her, but
Maybe
I
not you.
wall up.
You do,
I
actually.
do all the time, and it's really, really.
So how does it work?
What do you mean?
I just said,
How's it work?
yeah.
They start feeling emotions, and I'm like, nope. And then I start blocking them off, and then I start
Blocking
feeling
them?
them,
You're doing it like a rapper.
Fucking.
and then
Yeah,
I'm
blocking
like,
who off?
no.
Everyone? Or people?
Yeah.
Yeah, everybody.
So
So-
It's too hard to feel emotions. And then when you start becoming vulnerable, you're like, oh my god, there's so many of them. What do I do with
Many of
it?
what?
And then you
Feelings?
just start blocking them off again.
So
And it's good until it's not.
I'm glad you think that's funny. I don't think it's funny.
So
It's not funny. It's
I'm
hard
not
to.
laughing.
Yeah.
It's hard to
I think
do.
it's, you know, pain.
It's shitty.
it's
I'm
actually
trying to understand, like, you know,
I know the feeling, but it's hard to like. I mean, like navigating feelings is like one of the worst things in the world because like they can lie to you all the time.
Who can?
The feelings, and like I mean,
Wait,
you have
who
things
lies
come
to
up.
you?
You have things come up, and you're like,
Yeah.
you know, like you have legit feelings, and then like worry starts coming in, and that brings more feelings.
Mhm.
And then
That
you're
is
like,
so prescient.
stop, just stop. Like this isn't true. Like you'll fight against it, and it just keeps
Mhm.
happening like over
Yeah.
and over. So you're like, okay, well let's build up a wall so I don't have to feel anything. And then
But you
stuff
wanna
starts
feel-
breaking it down.
You wanna feel?
You do, but you don't. Like you don't want to feel bad things.
No.
The
you
good
don't
things
feel
are
bad
fine.
things.
But once the bad things come in, you're like, fuck that.
I get it. Yeah, totally. Honey?
But it's, you know, it
That's
sucks.
amazing. When you said.
But you do have to like, I mean, like feelings are something.
Trust.
Yes. Like with other people, like giving other people certain emotions to work with is a thing.
Yeah.
But when they are detrimental to you, you're like, oh, let's rein it back. And it's just very hard to work with.
Yeah.
So it's like a push-pull
I
thing.
understand.
I feel like I can't trust
Yeah,
my
grateful.
emotions like half the time.
Well, that's actually like another thing to talk about here. It's just that particular issue of like, number one, struggling through feelings, because one of the things that happens with this whole like hopelessness issue is that when we become, you know, a slave to this, as it were, we find ourselves in places where we don't believe that we can handle those hard emotions. And what's more is that puts us in places where we start believing really weird things. Like, it puts us in survival mode. And in survival mode, we're basically just trying to do whatever we can to get by, as opposed to actually being able to be okay. So it's a matter of, am I functioning versus am I actually okay? And that's the thing, is sometimes it can be really hard to be in that okay place, because you have to actually fight through and wrestle with some really hard things. And when we're facing, you know, when we talk about this whole thing about like, okay, you know, those spirits, those self-perpetuated things, like my mindset, my poverty mindset, that I'm never going to amount to anything, that comes with so much emotional baggage. And that's a lot of stuff to have to work through. And that's not a simple matter of, well, I'm just going to spend a Thursday evening sitting down and wrestling with my emotions until I overcome them. No, it's a long, drawn-out process, as you have to face these things and why they come and where they come from. And then as we grapple with them and overcome them, it's a gradual process. It's not simple, but it's important. Very, very important, because otherwise we tend to resort to coping mechanisms. And the destructive thing about coping mechanisms is that, as Dusty was putting it, they put up the walls. And granted, there's an important place to taking a break from just like grappling with all that emotional stuff, because it can overwhelm us, but not to the point where we're just stuffing it down all the time. Usually one of the most important things when we're grappling with those like emotional things is to wrestle with it, take a break, you know, distract yourself with something, and then come back to it when you've had a little bit of time to kind of let your mind relax, and then grapple with it again. And this is not easy. It's time consuming. It can be really hard. Sometimes you'll need a friend to sit there and talk you through it, because it's involving a lot. But the thing that we're ultimately going to have to, but it is stuff that we ultimately do have to deal with and struggle through. And that's important. So, it's okay. So it's one of these kinds of deals here. And, you know, nobody really likes to do this, because it's hard, but it's important. You know, when it's funny too, because like when we talk about this kind of thing, you know, talking about it in respect to the church and to God explicitly, it's one of those things where on occasion what we find ourselves dealing with is that we don't really see the value of this, or why we're supposed to do this, or where. And biblically, like, a lot of people don't really know. But, you know, I'd give you the example of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. And the way that Jesus, you know, when he went out into the garden, he sat there in front of God and he talked to God about what was going on inside, how he was feeling. He wept openly. You also look at the Psalms. The Psalms are just open pouring out of emotional things, feelings, thoughts, different things like that. David's Psalms are almost bipolar in like their effect and what they look like and how they feel. You know, one of the primary things as Christians, we go before God and we can lay this stuff down before him. And that's really Christianese of me to say, but basically all that it means is your prayer time can in fact be just you expressing all of your emotional baggage and why you feel the way that you feel. You don't have to go through some formal thing. Just because Jesus told the disciples, pray like this, doesn't mean that that's how every prayer needs to look. That was shown, I mean, David's Psalms were worship. They sung his songs in the temples as worship to God. You know, if you compare that to like something that Hillsong puts out nowadays, it's really, really different. You know, there's a lot of, God, why have you abandoned me and forsaken me? Where are you? How long will you let my enemies run amok and defeat me and bury me? That doesn't sound like something that you'd sing at church. But it's what they did back in the olden days, because that was real. And the truth of the matter is that relationship of any kind, including relationship with God, needs to be real. And that involves expressing those deep down things that make you have no hope. Why you believe the way you believe, why you feel the way that you feel all the time, why you think the way that you think. You can go before God and say, I don't believe that you'll ever do this for me. I know who you say you are, but I don't actually believe that, and here's why. You know, this stems back to this thing that I know about, or this thing that I know about. This is what the quantum of my life has looked like. I've been miserable and alone for 2 decades. Why would I come to you and believe that you're going to provide me a mate? These are things that are completely open for discussion with God. They're also things that should be open for discussion with the community that you're in. We all have friends that we can confide in, and if we don't, it's important to find them, because we need more than just ourselves to overcome our problems. You're not going to beat everything in a vacuum, especially if you have a lifetime of hopelessness sitting in front of you. So it's going to become a thing. And yeah, like there's a trial there and there's a struggle there, but it's important. And the truth of the matter is that at the end of the day, you know, talking about all of this stuff, and especially talking about those trials and struggles and pushing through them, you are worth it at the end of the day. And your health, spiritually, emotionally, physically, is all completely worth it. Going back to that point, God didn't die on the or Jesus didn't die on the cross because he didn't see somebody because he felt like everybody in the world and everybody in the future was worth it except for one person. No, it was for everybody. Every single one. Because every single one of us has that much meaning. We always forget, I feel, that God breathed into Adam. He gave a part of his own life essence, and in that regard, we all carry a bit of God's life essence. That's what life is. That's a part of each of us. which means that we have value, we have meaning, and we're not relegated to a life of hopelessness just because that's been our experience. We never should be. And that's what I got.